Good morning. I'll be speaking, it's a very large topic because traditions are very large. There is no limit to variations. For example, within the Christian tradition, there are thousands of different entities. But I will be largely focusing on, when we speak about the Abrahamic traditions, largely it will end up focused on Christianity because there are more than 3 billion Christians in the world. At least they label themselves as Christians. How many of them follow anything that Christ taught is a different matter. Same is true for every other religion. Do you think the Hindus are following what was taught by Krishna? No need to fantasize that one religion has got some monopoly of truth here. But also within Christianity, often I would end up focusing a little bit more on Catholicism simply because they are nearly half of the 3 billion people that are Catholics in the world. You probably all know that. Also, I often remind my Christian friends that Christ was a Jew. All his disciples were Jews. And when he was accused for destroying the tradition, he said, I have come not to destroy the tradition, but to fulfill it. What tradition is he fulfilling? Not a Christian tradition. It's the Jewish tradition that he's fulfilling. So often my Christian friends forget this because many wars have taken place. Politics always takes over. This is one of the difficulties. I often remind my friends that almost everything I say is so obvious, there is no reason why I should be saying it, or why do they invite me to say it? Who could disagree with this? That truth or the real or God is not Eastern or Western, nor Hindu or Christian. The wisest and the most sensitive people everywhere have searched for what is real. Eternal wisdom is transnational, transreligious, and transcultural. Of course, their expressions vary depending on the backgrounds of the exalted persons and the language used by them. Each expression has its grandeur and its limitations. But two main streams of spirituality, sometimes they get called Western and Eastern because of geographical reasons, but what the Western part includes is Abrahamic, Judaism, Christianity, Islam. So they can be just called Abrahamic traditions. And in Indian ones, Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, Sikhism. Of course, each one of them have many distinctions from each other, but if I were to focus on all the details, it will take many lifetimes. I don't think you want to put up with that for that long. These traditions are very large, and each one of them has hundreds of variations. Here is a reminder by William Blake in the Everlasting Gospel. The vision of Christ that thou dost see is my vision's greatest enemy. Thine has a great hook nose like thine. Mine has a snub nose like to mine. This is within the Christian tradition. Similarly, if you have seen the images of the Buddha in China, fat-bellied Buddha, this will completely surprise anybody in India. Because in India, if you look at the images of the Buddha, especially from the 7th century, you could practically see his back from the front. He's so emaciated. And then you have a fat belly Buddha in China. And I was surprised when you go to Japan, Buddha looks like a very Japanese kid. Naturally, this is quite obvious. So one should not be surprised by this. And so this remark by William Blake is a good reminder that if we go into all the details, it will take many lifetimes. I'm simply, and of course, this is the reason why scholars are always arguing with me, because this is what keeps their job, right? To get a promotion, you have to publish papers, and how do you publish it? You agree with somebody or you disagree with somebody. That's your publication. I have been a scholar in my life. I know what goes on there. Let's begin with a simple reminder that if we look at this, they were not looking at trillions of galaxies, just simply looking at the sky. When I consider the heavens, the work of thy fingers, the moon and the stars which thou hast ordained, what is man that thou art mindful of him? Anybody who seriously sees how limited our own existence is and how small the planet is on which we live, especially these days, they are talking about more than 2 trillion galaxies. One galaxy will do. If you ever really just look at the sky, you immediately can be aware of how small we are. And none of us is going to be alive for more than, let us say, if you're really bad, you could live for 120 years. But that's the maximum. If you're really bad to your grandchildren. Otherwise, most of us will die before 100. So, in that, when one realizes one's smallness in the presence of this vastness of reality, one really wonders, why are you mindful of me? So here is a reminder, vastness of the universe, 2 trillion galaxies pervaded by, from the perspective of all spiritual teachers, the entire universe is pervaded by cosmic intelligence. But there are many levels of consciousness, from the rocks to the absolute. Manifested universe this is difference from the contemporary scientific perspective. As you all probably know, since the 16th century, the scientific perspective has been that the whole universe began from matter without any consciousness. So if you are a physics student, you have to say MLT, mass, length, and time. That is the expression of the fundamental reality. From the perspective of all spiritual teachers, the whole cosmos evolved from the highest level of consciousness, not from the lowest level of consciousness. But then, of course, it's manifested at various different levels. It's possible that a rat has a little less consciousness than I do, so there are different levels of consciousness. But then the suggestion is that each level is wishing to evolve, to return back to home, to return to the source, to God. That's the overall perspective in all spiritual teachings. It's obvious that I did not create myself. A particle of divinity or the breath of God is what is keeping me alive. The fundamental characteristic of this self are love, truth, and joy. We cannot be fully ourselves until we give expression to that self, which is quite different from my usual worldly self. The usual self-occupation interferes with any connection with the self. Happily, in the Latin script, we have a capital S and a small s. But in Devanagari, in which Sanskrit is written, we don't have this choice. So there it has to be understood from the context. Then a reminder, whatever is this character called Ravi, he didn't create himself. What is keeping him alive? I have given quotations from 2 different traditions here. From the Bhagavad Gita, an eternal portion of myself becomes the jiva. This is Krishna's remark. In the world of jivas, and works upon the 5 senses as well as the 6th one, the manas, which are in Prakriti, in nature. 2 simple remarks here. Krishna, more than once in the Bhagavad Gita, includes manas among the senses. Manas is the ordinary mind, and it is basically really a prostitute of the senses. Whatever the senses wish or desire or fear, the manas will justify it. Which is the reason why very strong emphasis in the Bhagavad Gita that what is required is for us to connect with buddhi rather than manas. Buddhi has the same root as the word buddha, to discern, to awaken, and it belongs to a very different level. The trouble is in English they both get translated as mind, both buddhi and manas. Similarly, just to remind you that in early Greek, there is a word called nous, N-O-U-S, and dianoia, two different levels. Or Krishnamurti would speak about intelligence beyond thought and thought, making a distinction. Similarly, Gurdjieff speaks about higher mind, lower mind. But the reminder always is the lower mind, the usual mind, manas, is simply justifying whatever the senses either fear or wish. So he in fact ends up including it among the senses, as you can see it right here. Then a remark from Genesis, I often remind my friends there, the Lord God formed man of dust from the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being. Take a moment right now. If I am alive, it's not Ravi's breath keeping it alive. It's the divine breath or the breath of life that is keeping this creature alive for a few decades. When that breath leaves, that's the end of whatever is meant by Ravi. Therefore, very strong suggestion in any serious teaching to pay attention to this breath. Not my breath, but the breath in me. Which is why practically in all ancient languages, including in Sanskrit, Greek, Latin, Hebrew, the word for breath and for spirit is the same. The Sanskrit word prana means both breath and spirit. Most of my Indian friends don't realize this. They simply think it's only breath. But even look it up in the dictionary. Then the suggestion is that each level of reality wishes to evolve in order to return to the source. Here I quoted a remark from St. Augustine, our soul cannot be at rest until it is stayed in God. That is the only characteristic of the soul. But all our education goes against this, and therefore whatever we have as the starting as the soul doesn't develop. So I ask everybody here, ask yourself impartially, do I have a soul? Am I urging to relate with God? If I'm not, then I don't have a soul. Or I may have had a soul, but it is decreased in quality. Here I need to make another slightly general remark, because most of my Christian friends have got mixed up between two words, soul and spirit. Since the 16th century, largely because of the writings of Descartes, he who equated spirit with soul with the mind, if you can believe it. Great writers can do great mistakes. So be a little careful. In the New Testament, where if you all know that every book was initially written in Greek, there is a word for soul is psyche. In English we would say psyche, in Greek it's psyche. And the word for spirit is pneuma. As I mentioned earlier, the word for spirit in ancient languages has this dual meaning, namely it can be breath as well as spirit. So in Greek it is pneuma. So there are two distinct words. Soul is personal, your soul is different from my soul. But the call is that this soul wishes to evolve. That is why it has taken on this body mind, so that it can become to the level of the spirit, become transpersonal. That is the call. So these two words have a completely different meaning. One of them is personal, one is transpersonal. And the call is for my soul to evolve so that it can come closer to the spirit, which will be then closer and closer to God, to the very source. Which is why I quoted St. Augustine here earlier. In order to evolve, the soul, a particle of divinity, needs a body. Because here I am quoting to you from Ishwar Krishna, who is the author of Sankhya Karika, one of the great schools of philosophy in India. Spirit or Purusha, without the body is lame, and body without the spirit is blind. It is asserted in all spiritual teachings that the death of the body is not the death of the person. It's nice to say that, but is it true? Because if the person is associated with the body, that's the end. But if the person is associated with the soul, that's not the end. So this is really therefore the call. The death of the body is not the death of the person, that is asserted in all religious tradition. It is not the body that has a soul, it is the soul that has a body. One needs to be very clear about some of these things, because one imagines that somehow my body has got a soul. Well, that's a nonsensical remark. Because it's the soul, in order to evolve, needs something that will undertake the appropriate actions. Therefore, it needs a body and a mind to take the appropriate actions so that it can evolve. So the beginning of my creation, in my particular case, or in everybody's case, begins from the spiritual element, not from the physical element, which is generally the scientific perspective. Therefore, the spiritual perspective is completely contrary to the modern scientific perspective. And also these days, some of you may be familiar with this, a whole organization has been set up, especially in England, in the scientific medical network, called the Galileo Commission. Is somebody familiar here? Let me quickly mention this, not to go into more details here, but the whole purpose of that commission is, and many of the people participating in that are of scientific background, such including myself, but they're also interested in other things. So the purpose of that is to indicate that the universe is created not from the lowest level of consciousness, but from the higher level of consciousness. And that is largely also being supported by the near-death experiences. Many of you have probably heard about this, that a person may accidentally, or somebody killed somebody, dies, and sometimes they come back alive after an hour or 5 minutes or 5 hours. And during that time, although there is no breathing, no heart is beating, so they are officially dead. But still there is consciousness. They can even say what the doctor said to the nurse when they were supposedly dead. So therefore, the idea, or the fact, if you like, which is more and more certified now by many scientific observations, that consciousness can exist without connection with the matter. And that it is not that matter was initially the starting point, and gradually somehow two particles came together and life began. Later on, somehow consciousness began. Even though we may not know, but that's the underlying assumption from the scientific point of view. So then, obviously the suggestion is in each one of us, there are two, if you like, two sources of energy, or two in us. Self, I have put with a capital S, which sometimes gets called I, or spirit, or soul, and self with a small s gets called I, ego, flesh, body, mind. Different labels get attached, so don't not to get stuck with something or the other. And what are their main features? Self has to do with meaning, search for truth, love, beauty, expressed in compassion, awareness, and sense of service, and a sense of unity. Ask yourself, when was the last time you had any of these things? That is the true self-inquiry, that is the fundamental requirement for any spiritual development. Then the small s self has to do with fear, desire, gain, loss, survival, continuity, reward, punishment, exclusivity, approval, disapproval, knowledge, ignorance. Why shouldn't one be occupied with that? I have to survive in the world, so there is no reason to be against any of this. It's more really a question of finding their appropriate connection. Because if I did not have following the small s self and had not written some books, do you think they'll invite me here? No, I say this, so therefore it is silly to be against the small s self or against the ego. Ego is the actor. The question really is ego serving something or is serving itself? So if there are two in each one of us, I'm just simply labeling self and self, then the question is, am I the self coming from above and which does not die when the small s self dies, which is the body-mind, or am I the self which will wholly vanish when the body dies? So this question one needs to raise. So when it gets said in practically all religions that the death of the body is not the death of the body, they're just simply assuming this, but is one actually connecting with that reality? Is one practicing something to correspond to that? My impression personally is that religions have done more harm to spiritual search than anything else. And more organized the religion is, more harm it does. They don't encourage search, but just believe this or that and keep repeating it. I should here say, I was 9 years old when India was divided into India and Pakistan. And literally from the veranda, as a 9-year-old kid, I could see people killing each other, Hindus and Muslims. So I was so against religion, I didn't want to have anything to do with religion or studying religion. If anybody said, oh, it's a religious book, to hell with it, I was not interested. So my older brother said, it serves me right that I should retire as a professor of religion. So you see, I have to be punished for my attitudes. Here is a remark of Aldous Huxley. He wrote a rather, in my judgment, a very good book, very important book actually in 1949, a long time ago, where he concludes from perennial philosophy. By the way, some of you probably know, if you have read that book, he hardly quotes any philosopher. But he's quoting mostly the people who actually practice something or came to something. Similarly, Krishnamurti would periodically remind that philosophy is not love of thought, it's love of wisdom. But there he comes to 4 fundamental doctrines. I'm just quoting only the last one because that is relevant to here. Man's life on earth has only one end and a purpose: to identify himself with his eternal self, and so to come to unity of knowledge of the divine ground. According to Aldous Huxley, all this is the substance of the perennial philosophy. Mostly quoting, as I said, not a few philosophers are quoted by him. For example, Shankara, Plotinus, one or two others, but mostly it's people who are actually practicing something. And Plotinus makes this remark, which is the reminder: our soul is amphibious in nature. It can sink completely into matter, or it can soar into the one. It usually gets occupied with the instruments which are supposed to help its evolution, and just simply gets sink into the matter. This is Plotinus. Personally, for me, he's the most favorite philosopher from the Western philosophy that I come to, because he also practiced something, not simply talked about it. One common lesson of all scriptures and sages: as long as I remain the way I am, I cannot come to truth or real or God, whatever label you keep putting on it. What is needed is a radical transformation of my whole being, and the aim of any spiritual practice is not freedom for myself, but freedom from myself. And I will give you 2 or 3 quotes to indicate precisely that. Here is a remark of Christ in the Gospel of Matthew: he who would follow me must leave self behind. Then Shatapat Brahman, a great text in India: only those may enter the sun door who can truly respond to the question, who are you? With nobody. So you see, the call in the spiritual practice is to become a nobody. Try very hard to be nobody. That's the call. As you can see, it seems very contradictory, but Ansari of Herat, probably some of you know, a great Sufi sage from the 16th century, know that when you learn to lose yourself, you will reach the beloved. There is no other secret to be learned, and more than this is not known to me. Actually, it's mostly in the Sufi tradition and a part of Krishna cult that God is referred to as the beloved. Most other places, that's not the way it gets referred. So far, I have spoken mostly what is common to all these traditions. Now I want to focus on what are some of the differences. Instead of a myth of creation, India has what I call, I have never heard anybody refer to this as this expression, this is my expression, a myth of emanation. Brahma, which is the label for the highest reality, it literally actually means the vastness. And Annie Besant realized that the word vastness in English doesn't convey the sense of time. It just seems to be space. So she translates this as eternal. But in any case, whatever the translation is, I'm just reminding you, this is meant to be something unlimited, largeness, vastness. So Brahma did not create the world. The world emanated from the substance of Brahma. Brahma is not only in everything, it is everything. Brahma is manifested at different levels of consciousness or of materiality. Every level of materiality has a particle of Brahma in it. Even the rocks, from the perspective of Indian tradition, have a particle of Brahma in it. And I'm quoting here from Krishna, repeating more or less the same idea in slightly different language. And everything is born from the union of the field and the knower of the field. I am the knower of the field in every field. This is Krishna saying. The oldest Upanishad, Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, actually makes a little clarifying remark, which I will quote here. Because then one can imagine as if Brahma is stuck in the universe. So the oldest Upanishad says that a spider web emanates from the substance of the spider, but the spider can move anywhere on the web or away from it. So everything emanates from the substance of Brahma, but Brahma can move away from the manifested universe or anywhere in the manifested universe. This is the oldest Upanishad trying to describe this, trying to clarify this. So just quickly to look at it, in the Abrahamic tradition, there is the creation myth, and there are radical differences between one level and the other. That was the main reason why in 1867, when the idea of evolution of animals evolving into human beings was rejected in the Western tradition, especially in the Christian context, because that will mean that animal can become human and human can become angel. This is completely forbidden. Even the highest angel cannot come to God. Highest angel is Lucifer, by the way. You probably all know that. And it's HPV especially labeled the journal Lucifer as a reminder. And in the Indian tradition, this is just my diagram trying to clarify something. You don't find this in the Upanishads or anything. It's really an emanation, as if everything has a continuity. Even matter has a particle of Brahma in it. For example, I was completely surprised to read that a cow belonging to the ashram of Raman Maharishi, we call him Maharishi, meaning the great sage, Raman. Apparently, this cow used to come to him on his birthday, every year on his birthday, and will bow to him. And when this cow died, according to Raman, I don't understand this, but I can hardly disagree with what he says. According to Raman Maharishi, the cow was now enlightened. It may well be that in a previous incarnation, she or he, whatever the cow was, did something wrong and was degraded, and later on she did something right and was uplifted. I don't know that. I'm merely mentioning this to you, but this is an indication that even an animal can in principle evolve and come back to Brahma. That's the principle behind it. Whether it is actually the case for many situations is hard to know. Here, I won't spend much time on this. This is actually in my book, Whispers from the Other Shore, where I try to point out. And here I am mostly focusing on the Judeo-Christian tradition, not the Islam so much, but Islam is very much following. You all know they regarded Christ to be actually a greater prophet than Prophet Muhammad in the Orthodox Islam, except that Prophet Muhammad is the last of the prophets. So they are not against what Christianity was saying. So here you see some of the differences. In the Abrahamic tradition, the starting point is from God. It therefore has a very prophetic nature to it. God takes you never hear anybody searching for something. Was Moses searching for something? He's running away from the law, having killed an Egyptian soldier. He meets a farmer, quite understandably falls in love with his daughter, so marries him, and then he suddenly sees a burning bush. He's not searching for something. You never hear that. He may be searching, but we don't know anything about it. But in the Indian tradition, look at the Buddha, the story of the Buddha. Or in contemporary times, Raman Maharishi, Vivekananda, Aurobindo. So in one case, it is very much beginning from God, starting from God. God takes the initiative, and then he holds somebody by the scruff of his neck, and he has no choice but to follow what God wants him to do. That's called a prophet. Prophet in Greek literally means instrument. So they become instruments of God's will. That's the literal meaning of the word prophet in Greek. Whereas in the Indian tradition, there is a searcher, and I just try to point out here, because he may be feeling ignorant or illusion or craving, etc. So I don't want to go into more details here, so let me move on. So just look at some of the key words, and especially, as I said, I'll focus here on Christianity, mostly because of among the three Abrahamic religion, it is the major religion. And these are the standard words: sin, faith, prayer, salvation. Whereas in the Indian tradition, you see these other words. I had to give their Sanskrit expression simply because it's difficult to give one word translation of accurately. But I have also tried to give their translation. Avidya, Jnana, Sadhana, Moksha. Buddha and Krishna are teachers or models, but they are not saviors. I have never heard that said about them in India. The four great enunciations, which are called Mahavakyas, of the Vedantic tradition are, just simply read the English part here: I am Brahma, or you are that, or this Atman is Brahma, or intelligence. It's difficult to translate the word pragya, but intelligence or consciousness or wisdom is Brahma. In fact, that Atman, your deepest self, is identically the same as Brahma, is said to be the supreme identity in the Indian tradition. In the Abrahamic tradition, no creature can be like the Creator. That applies even to the highest angel, Lucifer, which literally means light bearer. And here I've quoted to you from Prophet Isaiah. How have you fallen from the heavens, O Lucifer, son of the dawn? How are you cut down to the ground, you who mowed down the nations? You said in your heart, I will scale the heavens above the stars of God. I will set up my throne. I will take my seat on the mountains where the gods meet, in the recesses of the north. I will ascend above the tops of the clouds. I will be like the Most High. That is not permitted in the Abrahamic tradition. In all spiritual teachings, God or Brahma or truth is Middle Ages, especially Christian scholars used to call it totalitaire or elitaire, so I thought I'll use that expression here. No description or expression, whether philosophy, music, or art, can capture it. The Upanishads say neti neti, not this. No description is acceptable. Whatever can be known or seen is not Brahma, as the Brahma is the knower and the seer. However, in the Indian tradition, strong emphasis that the wholly other is intimately myself. That is really the call for serious meditation. To see the divine in you, to see as deeply as you can, because deep down, Atma is Brahma. That is a fundamental remark, one of the 4 quotations that I just gave you here. And also, of course, in the Buddhist tradition, look within, you are the Buddha. This is in the Dhammapada by the remark of the Buddha. In India, the aim of human life is to realize the oneness of the deepest self with the highest divinity. Atman is identically the same as Brahma. As I just mentioned, that's called the supreme identity. But in the biblical tradition, a human being, however sublime and exalted, cannot become God. If anybody came close to claiming that, they were crucified, killed in other ways, or excommunicated. I've just given you 3 examples here. In the Jewish tradition, Jesus, remember, he's in the Jewish tradition, not in the Christian tradition. I keep reminding my friends here. And then Al-Halaj in the Muslim tradition, Eckhart in the Christian tradition. Here, I just give that very example. Jesus said, the Father and I are one. When some of the crowd again reached for rocks to stone him, Jesus protested to them, many good deeds have I shown you from the Father. For which of these do you stone me? It is not for any good deed that we are stoning you, the crowd retorted, but for blaspheming. You who are only a man are making yourself God. This is not my remark, I've just given you the precise reference here. Then another difference you would see. This is a very common practice in the Abrahamic tradition to say God is omnipresent, omnipotent, and omniscient. First of all, I recommend to people also to add these 2 other words here, omni-amorosus, all loving, and also omni-delectabilis, or delightful. All loving is actually not all that strange even in the Abrahamic tradition. I recommend to you strongly to read the first letter of John, especially chapter 4 and 5, where it is said, God is love. In the biblical tradition, God is personal. You see, they are not saying God is consciousness. They are saying God is conscious. This is the reason it becomes personal. Involved in listening to prayer and reacting to the actions of his creatures. Spinoza, perhaps the greatest Jewish philosopher, refused to accept the notion of a personal God. And he was excommunicated from the Jewish society at the age of 23. Even his family would not speak to him anymore after that. Einstein said in a public, this was in 1941, giving a convocation address at Columbia University. He made this remark, in their struggle for the ethical good, teachers of religion must have the stature to give up the doctrine of a personal God. Some Protestant ministers and Jewish rabbis in USA at that time launched a campaign to send him back to Germany for saying this. So one needs to see how strongly emphatic emphasis there is on a personal God. Whereas in the Indian tradition, you don't say truthful, which will be referring to a human being or to a person, but you say that the qualities of the ultimate reality of Brahma are Satyam Ritam Brahat, truth, order, vastness. Other ones get, in the Rig Veda there are several expressions, light, eternal, love, or in the Upanishad one get truth, consciousness, and delight. It's not saying one who is truthful. It is more saying truth. Therefore, it's not referring to a person. which is also the reason that Brahma is not masculine. In my judgment, the reason why God is called He in the Abrahamic tradition, I keep asking all my various Christian and Jewish friends, why is God called He? None of them, why not she? None of them seem to answer it. My personal impression is that the reason is basically because the initiative is taken by God. And traditionally, because of the quality of genitalia, activity was corresponding to males and receptivity to females. So, because God is active, taking the active initiation, so He's He. Brahma is neuter, beyond genderification, which is another reason why in the Sanskrit, if you have to study it, it's not only masculine, feminine, but there is also neuter. This requires, similarly, I don't have time to go into the details of this. None in the manifested world, the gods like Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva, they cannot act without their feminine energies. Therefore, you have not only singular, plural, but also dual. Makes Sanskrit a little bit more complicated. In India, the highest reality is frequently described as Sat Chit Anand, which will be truth, consciousness, and joy. Anand is difficult to translate. It can be happiness, joy, delight. Aurobindo made this lovely remark, which I very much like. Delight created the universe for delight. This is Sri Aurobindo's remark. But even the pleasure of sexual love is included in the overall encompassment of Ananda, as shown on the lower stories of some temples. Some of you, if you've been to India. But you know, Christians don't like sex, especially if they are from England, even more less so. But I don't want to go into the details of this, but you see many temples in India, the lower stories would have sexual expressions. Why be against that? None of us will be here unless somebody had had sex, right? So, but somehow people get so occupied with this. But Ananda, delight or joy, is a feature of Brahma, and all levels of the cosmos have Brahma in them. Even the usual sexual pleasure is included and portrayed in the lower stories of many temples, indicating that highest Ananda consists in the realization of one's identity with Brahma. It is not possible to find such images in any synagogue or church or mosque. In India, the emphasis is on monism, but in the Abrahamic tradition, the emphasis is on monotheism. One needs to be very clear about this. For example, it all began actually with the Jewish Shema, which I quote here. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God. The Lord is one, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. Throughout history, monotheism has resulted into my-theism. Who would say there is one God and it is your God? Who could possibly say that and be sensible? Now, as you probably know, in Indonesia, they don't even allow you to translate God as Allah. Allah just is a uniquely Islamic expression for God. So in the Indian tradition, there is much emphasis on the oneness of all there is, whereas in the Abrahamic tradition, the emphasis is on the uniqueness of everything. In India, it is frequently said that a realized person's individual spirit merges into the cosmic spirit. Such expression cannot be found in the Abrahamic tradition, where even the highest prophet remains unique and separate from God. Here I have quoted to you from Exodus. The Lord used to speak to Moses face to face like two people talking to each other. Then Moses would come back to the camp. So he's not merging into the Spirit of God or something, which will be the more or less the Indian way of saying encountering the divine. over a period of at least 5,000 years, the sages in India have repeatedly said that there is an underlying unity of all that exists, including everything we call animate or inanimate, and that the cultivation of wisdom consists in the realization of this truth. The expression of this fundamental insight vary in time, but the insight itself is said by the sages to be a part of eternal order, Sanatana Dharma. Again, I don't want to go into details of this. Whatever gets called Hinduism, the word Hindu or India are not of Indian origin. You probably all know that, so I don't want to go into the details of this. It's called Sanatana Dharma in the Indian tradition. This dharma is not only coexistence with the cosmos, but it provides its stable foundation. Sri Anirvan, who was a very great sage, and I had a great fortune to meet him for about half an hour, practically on his deathbed. This is what he said to me when I was leaving in 1977. You will know something real when you realize that God is the same as dog. But you see, this is where one also has to see the other side. If a mad dog was just about to bite my granddaughter, do I worship him because he's God? So there is a difference of understanding and different of action at different levels of reality. It is true that especially in the non-manifested universe, which is what a great sage is able to connect with, God is the same as dog. Everything is God. But at the manifested universe, this is the reason I'm pointing out to you that it is quite crazy to get so attached to this expression or that expression because it has been coming from a great sage. At what level is this true? In the Indic tradition, to hold on to a separate individuality in any ultimate sense is regarded as a mark of ignorance. Whereas in the biblical tradition, individuality is seen to be a mark of responsibility. So therefore, no need to be against either. This is the reason I'm trying to point out here. Not that one tradition has got a monopoly of truth and the other doesn't. Every expression has its limitations. Great sages do their best to try to express something, but then it gets stuck in the churches or the temples. But so here, look at it. In the biblical tradition, individuality is seen to be a mark of responsibility, and therefore individuality is preserved everlastingly, even though it may be permanently in heaven or in hell. The most obvious feature of a person's individuality is the body. Therefore, the emphasis in the Abrahamic tradition is to preserve the body even after death. In the Abrahamic tradition, there is a lot of emphasis on preserving the physical body even after death. That is the reason burial after death rather than cremation. For thousands of years, Jewish law has held that burial in the ground was the only acceptable option for the Jewish faith. Today, although the Jewish religion still generally discourages cremation, Reformed Judaism has begun to be more accepting of that practice. Like Judaism, Christianity through most of its history has been opposed to cremation. However, in recent times, cremation has become more acceptable within most of the mainstream Protestant churches, as well as Catholicism. But in Greek and Russian Orthodox churches, cremation is forbidden for a Christian. Of all world religions, Islam is probably the most strongly opposed to cremation. Cremation is considered by Islam to be an unclean practice. In fact, even if a Muslim has a Hindu friend who is being cremated, they don't want him to go to his cremation area. It's very strongly resisted in Islam. In Hinduism and Buddhism, cremation is the standard practice. In fact, there is a strong emphasis on getting rid of anything belonging to the person who has died. in order to free their spirit to move to another realm or even return to another body. Therefore, as a person is about to die, he or she will be lowered to the ground so that the bed does not have to be given away. It has become a common social practice. It happened in my own case. On one occasion, I had a very high fever. The doctor said he's not going to survive overnight, so they lowered me down on the ground. My sister stayed all night putting ice cubes on my head and saved me. In the Indian tradition, the root source of all our difficulties, impediments and obstacles is avidya or agyan. Therefore, any freedom from obstacle requires vidya or jnana. These are usually translated as knowledge. However, the knowledge aimed at here is quite different from what we usually call knowledge these days. For the knowledge these days, the paradigm example has become the scientific knowledge. That's not the kind of knowledge they're speaking about here. Here I quote to you, for example, in the Yoga Sutra, you see the avidya or ignorance is the cause of all the other obstacles, whether dormant, attenuated, intermittent, or fully active. Similarly, Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita, O Bharata, take up your own sword of sacred knowledge and cleave asunder this doubt that has arisen out of ignorance and has occupied your heart. Be firm in yoga and arise. Similarly, the Buddha says in Pali, avidya paramam malam, ignorance is the great blemish. That is the root cause of trouble in the Indian tradition. But it's a slightly different kind of thing. Jnana born of discernment is liberating, comprehensive, eternal, and freed of time sequence. Christ said, before Abraham was, I am. Now here is one of the greatest sages in the history of humanity. Then they picked up stones to throw at him. The very next verse in the Bible. This is why I've given you the quotation, quote their reference there. In the Abrahamic tradition, the root cause of all our troubles is sin owing to disobedience of the will of God. This began in the Garden of Eden when Adam ate the fruit of the tree of knowledge, contrary to God's command. In the Christian tradition, this leads to the doctrine of original sin, especially in Catholic Church. Since we are progeny of Adam, at the very moment of birth, we inherit this sin. From this sin, we can be saved only by faith in Christ. The distinctive characteristic of the biblical religion is not jnana, gnosis, or subtle knowledge. So you see, the Gnostic Gospels were non-canonized. But you see much more clarity or much more similarity between them and the Indian teachings. But more emphasis on faith. Faith is, here I'm quoting to you, faith is the wholehearted adherence to the message of God, whether in the form of the Torah, the prophetic utterances, or in Jesus Christ, the only Son of God, or in the message received by Prophet Muhammad. Here is a quote from the letter to the Romans, whatever is not of faith is sin. The Abrahamic tradition is essentially prophetic in nature. God takes the initiative and selects a person to be his instrument for his revelation. As I already mentioned, the word prophet in Greek means an instrument. And the examples are Prophet Abraham, Moses, Muhammad. The Indian tradition is essentially mystical in nature. A human being takes the initiative and searches for the truth. The examples are the Buddha, or in contemporary times, Vivekananda, Ramana, Aurobindo. Traditionally, activity is associated with the male gender and receptivity with the female. In my understanding, that is why God is referred to as He in the Abrahamic tradition, whereas Brahma is above genderification, therefore neuter. In the Christian tradition, owing to the emphasis on sinfulness, we need to be saved or redeemed. Therefore, Christ is the Savior. There is hardly a shortage of sin in India. Let me remind you of this. Right now, 40% of the elected members of parliament in India have criminal records against them. Take my word for it. So there is no shortage of sin. But there is a very strong emphasis, on the other hand, traditionally, as I quote here, that human beings are children of eternal life, amritasya putra, as the Rig Veda says and the Upanishads repeat. So one is aiming at moksha or mukti, which is liberation or freedom from one's forgetfulness of one's real nature. The Buddha or Krishna are not saviors, they are teachers who can teach us and show us the way. In the Abrahamic tradition, action in and care of the manifested world are highly valued. See, one needs to see the other side also here. In the well-known Lord's Prayer, one prays to God, "Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven." In the Indian tradition, I may not have time to emphasize this very much, strong emphasis on going beyond manifestation, not to be born again, as if it's a bad idea to be in this universe doing anything good for anybody. It's a very strange emphasis. Not to be born again. Even in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says that those who are liberated, they are not born again. And strong emphasis on this. Several modern Indian sages, for example, Vivekananda, Aurobindo, Tagore, Gandhi, were much influenced by the Western culture. Aurobindo's emphasis was on spiritualizing the material world rather than ignoring it and trying to go to the pure spirit. That happened very much from this remark of Shankara. Again, I don't have much time to go into the details. Shankara makes this remark, Brahma Satya Jagat Matya. Only the Brahma is true and all this manifested universe is just illusion. So no damn care needs to be taken of this world. Just move away from it. If any of you have gone to India, everybody can take care of their home very nicely, but in the neighborhood they're pure hell. Nobody gives a damn. This all arises from this very strong emphasis that the manifested universe is just illusion. One needs to be not to be born again to be free of it. So one needs to see the very strong emphasis in the Abrahamic tradition to take care of this world. In fact, even there is always the negative side of something, but for example, Christians in India started orphanages, schools for destitutes or people who didn't have much money, etc. But it's also true that the other side is to try to conquer everything. If you look at the planet, since the 16th century, the whole planet has been controlled by people of Christian background. But the other side is to take care of the manifested universe. Just as many modern Indians have been much influenced by Western thought, many modern Westerns coming from the Judeo-Christian tradition have been much influenced by the Indian tradition, especially by its emphasis on meditation, self-study, and subtle knowing. For example, Annie Besant, Krishna Prem, whose name was Roland Henry Nixon, Madhav Ashish, whose name was Alexander Phipps, Lama Anagare Govind, so I have given you their original names there, and Bede Griffiths, Thomas Merton. Now we are very much in a global culture, so it is really almost limiting oneself not to be aware of the other tradition, what one can learn from the other traditions. If we keep insisting exclusively on oneness, we cannot see the grandeur of each human being and his or her unique potential. On the other hand, if we insist too much on uniqueness, then we don't appreciate the one divine source from which everyone emerges. Some cannot see the woods for the trees, some others cannot see the trees for the woods. Oneness without uniqueness is unmanifested. Uniqueness without oneness remains insignificant. There are other differences. For example, in the Abrahamic tradition, very strong emphasis on scriptures. Nobody can possibly go beyond scripture. But here is a remark of Shankara. I'm not a great fan of Shankara myself, but he's regarded as a great philosopher. When the awakening takes place, scripture ceases to be authoritative. Even Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita says something very similar. All the scriptures have as much value for those who have spiritual discernment as the water in a well has when there is a flood of water on all sides. When your awareness is free from the tangle of delusion, then you will become indifferent to what has been said by the scriptures and what might be said. When your awareness, now perplexed by the scriptures, is steady and stable in contemplation, then you will attain yoga. You cannot find an expression like this in the Abrahamic tradition. Anything against the scriptures, you'll be in real trouble. In India, the emphasis is on inner divinity, therefore on meditation. In the biblical tradition, God is higher and above us, therefore the emphasis on prayer. No portrait of any biblical prophet or of Christ shows them in meditation. No portrait of the Buddha, Vivekananda, or Aurobindo shows them in the form of prayer. I always invite my friends to have the attitude of prayer and the posture of meditation. Attitude of prayer means submitting to something much higher than oneself, wishing to receive it, wishing to welcome it, but looking deeply inside to see where one can find the identity with this divine element. So, attitude of prayer and posture of meditation, this is what I strongly. Here I mentioned this here. All the Abrahamic religions are based on a particular event or a particular person. Hinduism has no shortage of important persons or events in its history, but it is Sanatan Dharma, which means eternal order. It's not based on any particular rishi or a particular event. Of course, Buddhism is focused on a specific person, Siddhartha Gautama, who became the Buddha. But even there, the call is look within, you are the Buddha. So I think I will stop now. I recommend for you to, I have some of the articles on my website. You're welcome to look at them.
Thank you. That was fascinating. I have a friend who's a very devout Christian, and I brought up with her one time the idea of that, Christianity says we're totally separate from God, and she disagreed with me vehemently. She said, she has Jesus in her heart, and that gives her oneness with God. And then the other thing is that I picked up from somewhere the idea that Krishna could be personal. You could have a personal relationship with Krishna. So just a couple of questions there.
No, in fact, all the Christian sages, particularly, let me actually mention to you, John of the Cross will be a very good example. He's regarded as the doctor of mystical theology in the Catholic Church, very strongly emphasized with one's oneness with the divine. So it's not, but this is the reason I said that there is so much variation in all of these religious traditions. But what gets generally suggested, here I'm talking about the general kind of expressions. But to everything that I have said, there are exceptions in each tradition. Take my word for it.
I wonder if you can explain the saying, the meek shall inherit the earth.
The
meek shall inherit the earth.
Yes. No, this is one of the things I actually point out coming from a Hindu background, that one realizes the remarks of Christ are often pointing out his own humility. And he even said that whatever you do for the least among you, you do it for me. And he washed the feet of his disciples. You will never find an example like this in the Indian tradition, I can guarantee. So there are many things to be appreciated in various traditions. But the reason I'm pointing out, it's good for us to understand what are some other major attitudes or differences that take place. One can get too occupied with going beyond this manifested universe, or one can get too stuck in this manifested universe.
You were talking about the evolution of animals and on the spiritual plane or the spiritual realm. So my Gnostic training years ago taught me that animals cannot be reincarnated as humans and humans cannot be reincarnated as animals. Recently, my Celtic mysticism training taught us that you can be reincarnated even as a tree. So I'm very curious, like what the Indian tradition believes in reincarnation. Recently, through some past life regression therapy, I've regressed people into being into their past lives as pets, etc. So I'm just curious what the Indian tradition believes in.
Well, first of all, let me make a slightly general remark. Each of the tradition is extremely large, and you can find almost anything. In fact, everything I said about the Indian tradition, I can guaranteedly find that somewhere in the Abrahamic tradition, and vice versa. So one has to be very careful about this. But it is true that in general, in the Indian tradition, the idea is that your reincarnation may be at a level higher than where you now are this time, or at a lower level. And that depends on the quality of your actions. Generally, that's the overall attitude. So it is possible for a person to be a human being in this life and to be a dog in the next life, or vice versa. This is the reason I gave that example of this cow in the Raman Maharishi ashram, where this is what Raman Maharishi said, that she's been enlightened. I find it hard to believe, but I can't disagree with him.
I have a question about translation. So you used the Sanskrit a lot. And Krishnamurti never used Sanskrit. He didn't like, he wanted everything to be understandable in English. And I think I understand why he does that when you use the Mahavakyas, for example, which, Tattvamasi or Aham Brahmasi, that they are translating the word Aham or Asi as I. And then we hear the I and we think I, the standard pronoun for a personal person. And so that causes a lot of confusion, right? So could you speak about how that going into the translation causes confusion and how important it is to understand what the original, in this case, Sanskrit, or it could be Hebrew or Greek or whatever, how important it is to know the original meaning of the word?
No, I actually completely agree with you. It is, even within India, I grew up in Punjab, and therefore learning Punjabi. Even Hindi and Punjabi, which are very close to each other, but you find some very subtle differences in the meaning of the same word in the two cases. So this is the reason why, really, if you are seriously interested in studying the Bhagavad Gita, let us say, what I try to do at the end of at least my translation, about 20 major words in Sanskrit, I try to point out to give their many different meanings, so that you don't need to learn the whole Sanskrit to study the Bhagavad Gita, but the key words are important to know in their original emphasis, because it is not easy to translate. You can, if you are familiar with any two languages within the Western tradition, let's say French and English, you'll be surprised how much difference there is in the slightly different feeling behind the translation. So, but obviously it's not easy to learn so many languages. But if you wish to seriously study the Bhagavad Gita, at least learn 20 key words in Sanskrit deeply. That's my recommendation.